She sat alone at the end of the bar like she didn't belong there, and maybe that was the point. No uniform, no rank, no reason for anyone to look twice at the woman nursing a glass of bourbon she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Around her, veterans swapped stories loud enough to rattle the bottles behind the counter. Nobody noticed her. Nobody asked. Then a Navy SEAL crossed the room, sat down uninvited, and quietly asked a question that wasn't on any public record. She answered in 2 words. The SEAL went pale. Because the unit she named had been erased from every official document, every database, every file that didn't require 3 levels of clearance just to acknowledge it existed. Shadow 6 Medical wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a legend. It was a classified wartime operation that the United States government had spent years pretending never happened. And the woman everyone in that bar assumed was just some civilian who'd wandered in from the wrong neighborhood? She was the reason one of America's most decorated special operations commanders was still breathing. If this story already has you hooked, I want you to stay with me all the way to the end. Because what comes next is going to hit harder than you expect. Hit like if you're already feeling it. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You don't want to miss where this goes. The bar was called the Anchor and Iron, and it sat 3 blocks from the waterfront in Caldwell Bay, the kind of mid-sized coastal city that had more veterans per capita than most people realized and more quiet suffering than anyone talked about publicly. It smelled like spilled beer and wood polish, and something fried in the kitchen that nobody could quite identify. The jukebox in the corner played classic rock at a volume that made conversation difficult unless you leaned in, which most people there preferred not to do. Emily Carter had been coming here on Thursday evenings for about 4 months. She always sat at the same stool, the one at the far left end of the bar, closest to the emergency exit, with a clear line of sight to the front door. She told herself it was habit. She knew it was something else. She was 31 years old, though she looked both younger and older depending on the light. Her dark hair was pulled back with the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that suggested someone who didn't spend a lot of time in front of mirrors. And her eyes were the specific shade of gray that people sometimes described as calm, and she knew was just tired. She wore jeans and a plain navy Henley with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, and there was a faint scar along the inside of her left forearm that ran about 3 inches and curved slightly, the kind of scar that didn't come from something minor. She worked at Caldwell Bay Regional Medical Center, 3rd floor, surgical step-down unit. She'd been there 14 months. Before that, 2 years at a VA clinic in Portland. Before that, a gap in her resume that she described to HR departments as a period of personal transition and that nobody had ever pushed hard enough to make her explain further. The bourbon in her glass caught the light from the neon sign above the bar, something advertising a beer brand that had gone out of business 6 years ago, and she stared into it without drinking. Around her, the Thursday crowd did what Thursday crowds at places like the Anchor and Iron always did. A group of former Marines near the pool table argued about something that had happened in Fallujah with a specific intensity of men who would never fully leave that argument behind. 2 Army vets at a high top were showing each other photos on their phones, laughing in the way that meant the photos weren't funny so much as necessary. A woman in her 60s sat at the other end of the bar, talking to the bartender about her son, who had just re-enlisted, and the bartender was nodding in a way that suggested he'd had this conversation before and understood it went nowhere useful. Emily watched all of it without appearing to watch any of it. She noticed the man who came in at 9:14 because she noticed everyone who came in, and because something about the way he moved through the room made her diaphragm do a small, involuntary thing it hadn't done in a while. He was tall, mid-30s, with a build that didn't come from a gym so much as from a life that demanded it. His hair was short enough to suggest recent military. His civilian clothes fitted well enough to suggest he'd been out long enough to figure out how to dress himself again, and his eyes moved across the bar in the same flat, systematic way hers did. Threat assessment. It happened before thought. He ordered a beer he didn't start drinking immediately, and then, instead of finding a spot with his back to a wall like she expected, he stood at the bar for a moment and looked around with the deliberate patience of someone searching for something specific. He found her. She looked back at her glass. A minute passed. 2. She heard the stool beside her scrape against the floor, and felt the air shift as someone sat down. "You've been here every Thursday for 4 months," the man said, not a question. "Same seat, same drink you don't finish." "That's a strange thing to lead with," Emily said without looking up. "I know." He didn't sound embarrassed about it. "My name's Marcus Hale. I'm former SEAL Team 8. I'm not here to bother you, and I'm not hitting on you, so you can relax about both of those things." She looked at him then, taking her time about it. "What are you here for?" "Honestly, I'm not completely sure yet." He turned his beer bottle slowly in his hands. "But I've been watching you sit there for the last 3 Thursdays, and there's something about the way you carry yourself that's been bothering me, and I finally decided I needed to figure out what it was." "That's either very honest or very weird." "Probably both." He tilted his head slightly. "You do that thing with your eyes, the sweep. You clocked me when I walked in, you tracked me to the bar, and you had me categorized before I ordered my drink. That's not a civilian habit." She didn't answer. "Where did you serve?" he asked. "I didn't say I served." "No." He held her gaze. "Where did you serve?" The jukebox shifted to something slower. Across the bar, the Marines had resolved whatever they'd been arguing about, or given up on resolving it, which was usually the same thing. Emily picked up her bourbon glass, held it for a moment, set it back down. "Army," she said. "Medical Corps. I got out 4 years ago." "What was your unit designation?" The question landed differently than the others, more specific, weighted in a way that made her look at him again more carefully this time, reading his face for whatever was behind it. She almost didn't answer. She'd gone 4 years without answering that question, and 4 years was long enough to build the habit deep enough that it felt automatic. But there was something in the way he'd asked it. Not casual, not fishing, more like he already knew the answer and was waiting to see if she'd tell the truth. "Shadow 6 Medical," she said. Marcus Hale went very still. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't drop his beer or stand up or make a sound. He just stopped. For about 3 seconds, the man who had walked into that bar with the specific competent ease of someone who'd spent years operating in places that would have ended, most people just sat there and didn't move. Then he exhaled slowly through his nose and said, very quietly, "I need you to tell me your name." "I already did. Emily Carter." Emily Carter, who served with Shadow 6 Medical. He said it like he was cataloging it. "Do you know how many people I could ask in this bar what Shadow 6 Medical was and get a blank look?" "I imagine most of them." "All of them." He turned to face her more directly. "That program was erased from public record in 2019. The unit designations, the deployment records, the personnel files, all of it went black. The only people who know that name are the ones who were there and the ones who were cleared to know about the ones who were there." He paused. "So I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand I'm asking it seriously, not as a conversation starter. Were you deployed to the Carvon Corridor in the fall of 2018? Emily's hand, which had been resting loose and relaxed on the bar, didn't move. But something in her changed anyway. A kind of internal recalibration, like a door she'd left locked for a long time had just been knocked on by someone who knew the right number of times. "Why are you asking me that?" she said. "Because I was there," Marcus said. "Not with your unit. I was 12 kilometers north, running a different operation that nobody talks about either, but I heard things. Afterward, when everything went sideways and the official story came out, and a lot of guys who were there knew the official story was wrong." He looked at her steadily. "I heard there was a medic who went in when she shouldn't have, who crossed a line nobody else would cross, and brought someone back who everyone above her pay grade had already written off." The bar noise pressed around them. Someone broke a pool rack with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, and Emily's eyes didn't flicker toward it, which Marcus noticed. "That's a story," she said. "It's the story that ended someone's career." Lots of people's careers ended around that time. One person's in particular. His voice was level. "The medic, the one who went in. The official after-action report said she acted without authorization, endangered the mission, and compromised the integrity of an extraction that was already in progress." He paused. "That was the version that went on record." Emily said nothing. "I'm going to say a name," Marcus said, "and I want you to tell me whatever you want to tell me, which might be nothing, and I'll respect that." He waited a beat. Logan Pierce. She looked down at her glass. That was enough. He's alive, Marcus said. It wasn't information. It was something else. He has a daughter who just turned 6. He runs a veteran support foundation out of Fort Carlisle. He coaches Little League on weekends, which I'm told he's terrible at. A pause. He still doesn't know who it was. Who came in? Emily picked up the bourbon and took a real drink this time. When she put the glass back down, her hand wasn't quite steady, which was the first thing Marcus had seen from her that suggested she was something other than controlled. That was a long time ago, she said. Yeah. He didn't push. It was. They sat quietly for a moment that stretched longer than comfortable and shorter than necessary. The bartender drifted past and refilled Emily's glass without being asked, the unconscious professional attentiveness of someone who'd spent years reading rooms. How did you find me? Emily asked. I didn't, not on purpose. He rolled the beer bottle between his palms. I moved to Caldwell Bay 8 months ago. My sister lives here. I come to this bar because it's the kind of place that doesn't ask a lot of questions, and I like that after the years I had. And then one Thursday I sat down over there. He gestured toward a table near the window. And I watched you come in and sit where you always sit and do the thing with your eyes, and something in my brain went, I know what that is. Not who, just what. He shrugged. 3 weeks of Thursdays before I could make myself come over. Why did you finally? He thought about it with the genuine care of someone who didn't like imprecise answers. Because I spent a lot of years in a world where the people who did the right thing got handled badly afterward, and I got tired of watching it happen and doing nothing, even in a bar, even when it's none of my business. Emily turned to look at him fully for the first time, with the kind of attention that wasn't just assessment anymore. You don't know what I did? No, he agreed. I know part of it, and I know what happened to you after. And I know those two things don't match, and that bothers me on a level I can't really explain except to say it has for years. He held her gaze. But you don't have to tell me anything. I just wanted to, I don't know, see you, I guess. See that you were real and not just a story that got handed around in the dark. Something crossed her face that he couldn't quite read. She looked back at her glass. I was a combat nurse attached to a special operations element in a classified theater, she said, quietly enough that the bar noise swallowed it almost entirely, and he had to lean slightly closer to catch it. My job was to keep the men in my assigned element alive long enough to get to surgical care. That was the whole job. Nothing more complicated than that. And in the Carvon corridor? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice had the flat quality of someone reciting something they'd long since finished having feelings about, and were now just reporting. The element I was attached to was running an HVT extraction, high-value target, intelligence-backed, supposed to be a clean in and out. The intelligence was wrong in 3 separate critical ways that I wasn't told about ahead of time, and wouldn't have been told about anyway because my clearance didn't cover the source material. She paused. Things went wrong fast and in multiple directions. The team scattered. 2 guys made it to the extraction point. 3 more were 2 kilometers out and moving. And 1, she stopped. Pierce, Marcus said. His GPS beacon was stationary. It had been stationary for 40 minutes, which meant either he was compromised or he was dead, and the commander running the operation from the forward operating base decided 40 minutes of stationary was enough to make a call. Whoa! Her jaw tightened, a small movement, nearly invisible. They were pulling the extraction, closing the window, writing him as a loss. And you didn't. I was the ranking medical personnel on the ground. My job was the men in my element. She turned the glass slowly. He was in my element. So you went in. I went in. The simplicity of it sat between them. Marcus didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would fit inside a sentence. I don't talk about it, Emily said. I haven't talked about it to anyone. Not in 4 years, not in the 2 years before that, when everything was... She caught herself. I don't talk about it. I know. He picked up his beer. You don't have to. Not to me, not tonight. But I want you to know that whatever the official record says, there are people who know better. Guys who were in that theater, guys who came out of it, guys who've spent years since then putting together what actually happened because the official version never sat right. He looked at her. You're not as invisible as you think you are, Emily. She almost smiled. Not quite. That's not as comforting as you probably mean it to be. Yeah, he acknowledged it. Fair. Outside, the wind off the bay had picked up enough to rattle the bar's front windows in their frames. A couple came in stamping wet shoes, laughing about something. The ordinary outside world noise of people who'd had a good evening and weren't carrying anything particularly heavy. Emily watched them find a table and shrugged her shoulders slightly. The unconscious movement of someone resettling under a weight they'd forgotten wasn't visible to everyone. She'd taken the job at Caldwell Bay Regional because the posting had been listed quietly through a veterans hiring network and had offered, among other things, a city where she didn't know anyone. That had seemed important 14 months ago. She still wasn't sure she'd been wrong about it. The work itself she was good at. Better than good, probably, though she tried not to make that obvious because obvious competence attracted attention, and attention attracted questions. She'd spent 14 months in the step-down unit moving through shifts with the methodical quietness of someone who understood that the whole point was the patients, not the person doing the work. Her colleagues thought she was reserved. Her manager thought she was a little too self-contained but reliable. Nobody had looked at her the way Marcus Hale had looked at her tonight. She wasn't sure what to do with that. "What do you actually want?" she asked him. "From this conversation, what's the point of it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told you, I'm not completely sure." "That's not an answer." "No." He conceded it honestly. "I think—" He stopped, reconsidered. "There's a man who's been looking for information about what happened to him in that corridor for 4 years, quietly. He doesn't talk about it publicly either, because publicly he's the hero who survived and built something out of it, and the foundation and the work he does matters, and he doesn't want to make it about him. But privately," Marcus turned the bottle again, "he hasn't let it go. He knows what the official report said. He knows it doesn't add up. And there is one specific piece of it that he has never been able to find, which is who came in when the window was closed and brought him home." Emily's glass was still. Her hand around it was very still. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Marcus said. "I want to be clear about that. You have every right to be exactly who you are in Caldwell Bay, with your Thursday bourbon and your shift work and your exit door, and nobody has any right to take that from you, but I also—" He paused. "He deserves to know. I think you might deserve for him to know. And I think the version of events that's sitting in the classified record right now is wrong in a way that matters more than just the two of you." That last sentence landed differently than the ones before it, and she heard it. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means there's more to it than what I've told you." He looked at her directly. "And I think you know that." She did know that. She'd known it for 4 years, in the specific way that you know something that you've been forbidden to act on, and have spent a long time training yourself not to reach toward. She knew it in the way that the scar on her forearm knew things, not thought, just present, just there. "There was a debrief," she said, "after I got back out, after the extraction was complete and Pierce was on his way to surgical." She kept her voice measured. "The officer running the operation. He came to see me before I was medevaced. He was very calm, very clear." She looked at her glass. "He told me what had happened would be documented as an unauthorized breach of operational parameters, that I had defied a direct order to stand down, that the outcome was irrelevant to the violation, and that the record would reflect accordingly." She paused. "He also told me that if I chose to contest that characterization, the review process would be very long and very thorough, and that a lot of things that were better left buried had a way of surfacing in review processes, for everyone involved." "A threat," Marcus said. "A promise," Emily said. He was very precise about that distinction. Who was he? She looked at Marcus then with the first fully open expression he'd seen from her all night, which wasn't warmth exactly, but was something like recognition. The look of someone who has spent a long time in a room alone and has just heard a knock at the door that sounds like it might be real. "His name was Colonel Gerald Voss," she said. Something happened in Marcus Hale's face. A shift. Small, but definite, like a calibration running quickly behind his eyes. "You know that name?" Emily said. "Yeah." His voice had changed, quieter, more careful. "I know that name." She watched him. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer immediately. He set his beer bottle down on the bar with a precision that seemed deliberate, the way someone sets something down when they need their hands free to think. Gerald Voss, he said slowly, retired from active service 18 months ago. Brigadier General. 2 rows of commendations, 3 service medals, a Distinguished Service Medal awarded for... He stopped. For leadership during a classified operational period in a theater that officially never existed. He looked at her. The Carvon Corridor, Emily. The bar kept doing what bars do. People laughed. A glass clinked. The jukebox moved from one song to the next. All of it felt very far away. He got a medal, Emily said. He got a medal. She sat with that for a moment that stretched like pulled wire, thin and taut and capable of snapping. What was it for? She asked. Specifically. For successfully managing an intelligence failure in a high-risk operational environment and ensuring that the operational breach was contained without further damage to classified assets. Marcus's voice was flat, factual. That's the language. I looked at the citation 2 weeks ago when I started putting things together. Contained. That's what they called it. Contained, Emily repeated, very quietly. He buried the real after-action report. He filed a version that put the intelligence failure on external factors and the operational irregularities on a junior medical officer who acted without authorization. He framed the whole thing so cleanly that it held up through 2 internal reviews. Marcus turned to face her. He built his last 4 years of career and his retirement commendations on the back of what he did to you, and to Logan Pierce, and to the 2 operators who didn't make it out. The last sentence landed in a specific place in Emily's chest, one she'd learned over 4 years to keep very quiet. There were 2 others, she said, Reyes and Cautry. His voice was careful. They were 2 kilometers out when the window closed. The official record says they were lost to enemy contact during the extraction attempt. He paused. There are guys who were there who have always believed that if the window had stayed open another 40 minutes, if the operation hadn't been called when it was, there was a real chance they made it to the extraction point. The cold that moved through her then wasn't the bar air or the wind off the bay or anything so simple. He made the call early, she said. He made the call early to protect the intelligence failure from going up the chain. If the operation ran long, there'd be scrutiny. If there was scrutiny, someone was going to start asking why the intel was wrong in 3 critical ways, and those questions were going to end up at his desk. Marcus held her gaze. He closed the window to control the narrative, and 2 men didn't make it home because of it. Emily Carter sat very still at the end of the bar in the Anchor and Iron in Caldwell Bay, with a glass of bourbon she'd barely touched, and a man she'd met 40 minutes ago, and felt the specific weight of 4 years of silence shift on its foundations. She had known part of this, not all of it. She had known that the call came too early and that it hadn't sat right, and that the debrief had felt like someone very carefully building a wall. And she had spent 4 years telling herself it didn't matter because the man who'd needed her to go in had made it out alive, and that had to be enough. It hadn't been enough. She'd just been very good at pretending otherwise. The records, she said, the real ones, the unredacted after-action report. They still exist. Marcus watched her. Everything the military buries gets buried somewhere, not destroyed. The classification system doesn't destroy. It compresses and seals and layers. But it can be unsealed, with the right people asking the right questions in the right sequence. He held her gaze. Logan Pierce has enough rank and enough of a record now that if he filed a formal inquiry, it would go somewhere. He doesn't know what to ask for, Emily said. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. No, he paused. But you do. She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face for the things people thought they were hiding but rarely did. The angle of the ask, the shape of the motive, whether this was something she could trust or something she should have walked away from the moment he sat down. What she found was complicated and human and not simple, but not wrong. Why now? She asked. Why come to me now? Because Voss gave an interview last month. Retired general, leadership legacy, military excellence. Something hard moved through Marcus's expression. He talked about the importance of officers who are willing to make difficult calls under pressure. about how the hardest decisions in command are the ones you have to make with incomplete information, and that a good officer accepts the weight of those decisions and moves forward. He stopped. He talked about the Carvon corridor. He mentioned the intelligence failure and how he made the call to protect his remaining assets when the situation became unrecoverable. He talked about grief, about losing men. The hardness in his voice tightened. He talked about it like it cost him something, like he was the one who lost something. Emily was very quiet. "And I thought about you sitting at the end of a bar in a city where nobody knows you," Marcus said. "And I thought about Logan Pierce coaching Little League badly on weekends and not knowing who walked back into hell for him. And I thought about Reyes and Khatri." He picked up his beer, set it down without drinking. "And I decided I was done being quiet about it." Through the front windows, the lights of Caldwell Bay pressed against the glass, the ordinary sprawl of a coastal city doing what coastal cities do on a Thursday night, indifferent and vast and lit up with the business of living. Emily watched it for a moment, and then looked back at her glass, and then looked at Marcus Hale with the eyes that he had correctly identified as something other than what they appeared to be. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I have spent 4 years building something small and manageable and mine. I have a job I'm good at, and a city where nobody asks too many questions, and I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not who I was. I don't know if I have the capacity to be that person again." "I'm not asking you to be," Marcus said. "I'm asking you to tell the truth. The rest of it goes without you." She almost said something then. He could see it in the way her mouth opened slightly and then closed. "Where is Pierce now?" she asked instead. "Fort Carlisle." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a plain white card with a handwritten number. He set it on the bar between them. "I called him 3 days ago, told him I might have information about the corridor. He told me whatever I had, he wanted to hear it." Marcus tapped the card once. "He doesn't know your name. He doesn't know it's you. But he's been waiting for this conversation for 4 years, Emily. Maybe longer." She looked at the card. She didn't pick it up, but she didn't look away from it either, and when the bartender came by again and looked at her glass, she put her hand over the top of it and shook her head, which was the first time in 4 months of Thursday evenings that she'd declined a refill. Small things. The kind of small things that didn't look like anything from the outside. Marcus stood to go. He pulled on his jacket with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years moving quickly and hadn't entirely stopped. "I'm not going to push you," he said. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. But I want you to know that whatever that report says, and whatever Voss built on top of it, there are people who know what the truth is, and some of them are starting to talk." He left a 20 on the bar and walked out. Emily sat alone for a long time after that, the card a small white rectangle in the periphery of her vision, the bar noise pressing around her with its ordinary human volume, the wind off the bay still rattling the windows. She thought about Gerald Voss giving an interview in his retirement comfort, talking about the weight of difficult decisions with the settled ease of a man who'd carried that weight so long he'd mistaken it for virtue. She thought about Reyes and Khatri, whose names she'd said once a day for 4 years in the specific way she wasn't going to call prayer. She thought about the moment she'd found Logan Pierce in that compound, in the dark, in the wrong place by every metric except the one that mattered, and the look in his eyes when he understood that someone had come back for him. She'd told him to stay quiet and keep pressure on his side and save his breath for moving. She had not told him her name. She picked up the card. She stared at the number on it for a long time, turning it over once, and then again, and then she put it in the breast pocket of her Henley, close to her chest, where the pulse was. Her shift started in 11 hours. She had a patient in bed 7 who'd had a rough night and would need careful monitoring through the morning, and a new admission coming up from the ER around 6, and a colleague who'd asked her to cover the first hour of rounds because of a school thing with her kid. She had a life. Small, manageable, hers. She folded her hands on the bar and looked at the front door of the Anchor and Iron and thought about Gerald Voss in his retirement, sleeping well. Something in her jaw tightened. She got up, left a tip, and walked out into the Caldwell Bay night. The night air hit her like cold water, salt and diesel and the faint rot of low tide. The smell of a working waterfront that didn't bother pretending to be anything else. Emily stood on the sidewalk outside the Anchor and Iron for a moment, one hand in her jacket pocket, fingers touching the edge of the card without gripping it. A car passed. Then another. Ordinary Thursday traffic, people going home to things that didn't weigh what hers weighed. She walked to her car, sat in it without starting it, and looked at the number on the card under the dome light. Then she put it in the glove compartment, drove home, and went to bed. She didn't sleep much. Her shift the next morning ran long, the way shifts always ran long when you were trying to keep your head down and your focus narrow. The patient in bed 7 spiked a low-grade fever around 6 that needed sorting before handoff. The new admission from the ER came up with incomplete paperwork and an allergy list that didn't match what the ER had sent up. And her colleague Donna, who was supposed to take rounds at 7, texted at 6:50 to say the school thing was running later than expected, and could Emily cover just a little longer, which in Donna's language meant another full hour. Emily covered it. She always covered it. It was easier than most things. By the time she got to the break room at 9:30, the coffee had been sitting since 7 and tasted like something that had given up. But she drank it standing at the counter because sitting felt like a decision she didn't want to make. "You look terrible," said a voice from the doorway. She looked up. It was Nate Soriano, one of the day shift nurses from the cardiology unit, who had the specific gift of saying accurate things in a way that was somehow not annoying. He was 38, always slightly rumpled, and had the permanently tired eyes of a man raising twin 7-year-olds largely on his own, while also doing a job that required complete attentiveness. Emily liked him in the low-maintenance way she liked a few people. No expectations, no performance, just the basic human acknowledgement that they were both doing a hard thing in close proximity. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Yeah." He poured his own terrible coffee and didn't ask why, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. He leaned against the counter on the other side. "You hear about the meeting next week?" She hadn't. She'd been avoiding the staff email chain for 2 days. "Whitmore's bringing in a consultant," Nate said. "Apparently there's been a flag discrepancy in the supply inventory, and someone from administration decided the solution was to bring in a third party to review unit procedures." "Supply inventory," Emily repeated. "Surgical supplies, mostly. Implants, joint replacement hardware, the expensive stuff." He shrugged. "I don't know the details, but Whitmore's been in and out of admin meetings all week, and Greta in scheduling told me the consultant firm has some kind of federal healthcare contract, so whatever it is, it's not small." Emily drank her bad coffee and filed that away in the part of her brain that categorized things as potentially relevant without yet knowing how. "When's the meeting?" "Tuesday, 3 o'clock. He pushed off the counter and grabbed his coffee to go. "Fair warning, though. If Whitmore's in the room, bring something to do. The man cannot get to the point." He left. Emily stood alone in the break room for another 2 minutes, then went back to work. She called the number on the card that evening from her apartment, sitting on the couch with the TV on mute and the lights low, because she needed something that felt like background without actually being noise. It rang 4 times. She was building herself a reason to hang up when it connected. "Pierce." The voice was deep, not quite rough, the kind of voice that had spent years giving instructions in environments where being heard clearly on the first attempt mattered. "Commander Pierce," she said. "My name is Emily Carter. I was given your number by Marcus Hale." A pause, short but real. "He told me someone might call." "Did he tell you anything else?" "He told me you had information about the Carvon corridor. He told me it was significant." Another pause. "He told me I should take the call seriously." "Okay." She looked at the dark television screen. "I was there." The silence that followed was different from the one before it. It had texture. "There," he said, not a question. "I was the combat nurse attached to your element's medical support. I was on the ground when the window closed." She kept her voice flat and informational, the tone she used when she was delivering difficult news to patients' families. Not cold, but contained, because contained was the only version of honest she trusted herself to sustain. "I'm the one who came in," she heard him breathe. "I need you to say that again," he said quietly. "I was the one who came in after the window closed. I found you in the compound, Sector 4, northeast corner, behind what was left of a generator housing. You had a fragmentation wound on your left side, 2 broken ribs, and a dislocated shoulder. You were conscious, but not reliably so. She paused. I told you to hold pressure and save your breath for moving. We got out through the service corridor on the building's south face. The silence this time lasted long enough that she almost spoke to fill it. I've been looking for you for 4 years, Logan Pierce said. I know. Her voice came out slightly less flat than she intended. I wasn't easy to find on purpose. Why are you calling now? It was the right question, and she gave it the answer it deserved. Not the short version, not the protected version, but the real one. She told him about Marcus, about the bar, about what Marcus had told her regarding the medal, the interview, the specific language Voss had used to describe the decision he'd made in the corridor. She didn't embellish, and she didn't editorialize, because she'd learned a long time ago that plain facts did more damage than dramatic ones. When she finished, Pierce was quiet for a long moment. Voss, he said. The word had weight to it, the kind of weight that accumulated over years. You knew him, Emily said. He was the senior officer on the operation. I filed 3 requests for the full after-action report over 2 years. All 3 came back with a standard classification hold. Something in his voice shifted. Controlled, but not as controlled as he'd started. I was told the intelligence failure was under ongoing review and that the full report couldn't be released until the review was complete. The review that was never going to conclude. The review that was never going to conclude, he confirmed. I hired a JAG attorney in year 2. She hit the same wall from a different angle. We eventually agreed that short of a formal congressional inquiry or a whistleblower with direct access, there was no path in. He paused. What Marcus thinks he can do. It's not just Marcus, Emily said. He mentioned operators who were in theater, witnesses. Witnesses to what specifically? To the timeline, to the sequence of the call, to the fact that the window closed faster than any operational necessity required. She steadied her voice. And to Reyes and Khatri. Pierce went silent again, and this time the silence was harder. You know those names? I was on the ground, Commander. Yes, I know those names. She heard him exhale, a slow, controlled breath that she recognized as the sound of someone managing something that wanted to come out differently. I have a daughter, he said, and the apparent change of subject wasn't one. She's 6. Her name is Maya. She knows I was in the army and that I got hurt once, and that some people helped me get home. He paused. I didn't tell her about Reyes and Khatri because she's 6, and the world is complicated enough. But I think about them every day. And I have thought about them every day for 4 years, and the idea that the reason they didn't come home was... He stopped himself. I need proof, Emily. Not testimony. Records. I know. Can Marcus get records? I don't know. He said he was working on it. She looked at the muted screen. I think the path goes through a formal inquiry, and I think the formal inquiry has a better chance with your name on it than mine. Another silence. My name opens doors, yours doesn't. That's not a judgment. That's just how it is. No, he said, with a tone that suggested he'd been carrying the shape of what she'd just said for a long time. It's not a judgment. It's true. And I don't like that it's true. He paused. Give me 48 hours. I need to talk to some people. Okay? Emily. He said her name like he was testing the weight of it. For what it's worth, I know what you did. I've known what someone did for 4 years, even when I didn't know who. And I've known it was the kind of thing that... He stopped again, and this time she let him stop without filling the space. I'm glad you called. She found she didn't have a clean answer for that. 48 hours, she said instead. She hung up, sat still for a moment, then got up and stood at her apartment window looking at the city lights of Caldwell Bay smearing against the low clouds coming in off the water. Her reflection was faint in the glass. Incomplete, slightly wrong, the way reflections in windows always were. She went to bed. She didn't sleep again. The Tuesday staff meeting was in the second-floor conference room, which was too small for the number of people Whitmore had decided should attend, and which smelled like old carpet and the ghost of someone's lunch. Director Whitmore was a 50-ish hospital administrator with the specific energy of a man who had learned to manage hospitals without ever fully understanding what hospitals were for. He wasn't malicious. He was something Emily found harder to navigate, which was incurious, genuinely uninterested in what he didn't already believe he knew, which meant that anything outside his established framework had to work very hard to reach him. He introduced the consultant briefly, with the particular inflection of someone who found the consultant's presence mildly threatening and had decided to cover that by suggesting the whole exercise was his idea. The consultant was named David Tran, mid-40s, lean, with the kind of organized stillness that came from having done this kind of work long enough to stop being impressed by any individual version of it. He had a badge that said Meridian Health Compliance Group, and eyes that moved around the room with a cataloging efficiency that Emily recognized from a different context. He laid out the nature of the review in clear, moderate sentences. A routine audit of surgical supply procurement had returned irregularities in the purchase records for orthopedic implant hardware going back 18 months. The nature of the irregularities suggested possible billing discrepancy, inflated vendor pricing, and, he used the word carefully, potential misappropriation. The room shifted with the particular collective discomfort of people who were being informed that the place they worked was possibly in serious trouble. Whitmore said something about full cooperation and the institution's commitment to transparency that nobody believed and nobody challenged. Emily sat near the back and said nothing and watched Tran work the room, and she noticed that twice during the meeting, Tran's eyes moved to the empty chair at the head of the table on the opposite side from Whitmore, the chair that belonged to the Chief of Surgical Services, Dr. Reginald Marsh, who was conspicuously absent despite having been on the attendance list. She noticed it because she noticed things, and because Tran noticed it, in the specific way of someone noting an absence that was more informative than a presence. After the meeting, in the corridor, Nate fell into step beside her. "So," he said quietly. "So," she agreed. "Misappropriation. That's the word he used. Marsh wasn't there." "No." Nate looked at the floor as they walked. "Marsh runs surgical procurement, has for 6 years. He's on every vendor contract, every approval chain." He paused. "I've thought a couple of things about some of those vendor contracts over the years that I've never said out loud because saying things like that out loud at places like this tends to go badly for the person doing the saying." Emily glanced at him. "Have you said anything to Tran?" "Not yet." He looked at her. "Have you?" "I just met the man." "Yeah, but you were watching him the whole meeting like you were doing math in your head." She didn't deny it. "I need to look at something first. If it's what I think it might be, I'll tell you before I do anything." Nate was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like the beginning of something that ends with one of us not having a job." "Maybe." He thought about it. "Okay," he said. "Tell me what you find." She spent that evening pulling what she could from the unit's internal purchasing records, not the restricted administrative files, but the floor-level documentation that nursing staff routinely accessed for supply ordering and inventory management. It wasn't the whole picture, but it was enough of the edges to recognize the shape. The implant hardware for surgical procedures ran through a vendor called Medavance Supply Solutions. The unit prices on the invoices she could see were 15 to 20% above the published market range for comparable products. The volume was high. The pattern was consistent going back further than she could see from where she was sitting. She thought about the patient in bed 7 last week, who'd come in for a hip replacement that had gone slightly wrong in a way nobody had been able to clearly explain, and the replacement hardware that had needed to be swapped out, and the secondary procedure that had added 3 days to the man's stay and a complication to his recovery that he'd asked her twice why it had happened. She closed her laptop, sat back, and thought carefully about the difference between what she suspected and what she could support. Then her phone rang. It was Marcus. "Pierce made contact," Marcus said without preamble. He reached out to 2 retired operators from the corridor operation. Both of them confirmed they're willing to provide formal witness statements. She sat up. "That's fast." "Pierce doesn't do things slowly when he decides to move." A pause. "But there's something else. He made some calls through his JAG contacts. People who know, people who can look at what's technically accessible without technically accessing it, if you understand what I mean. And they found something." "What kind of something?" "Voss filed a supplementary operational report 18 months after the corridor mission. It was attached to a personnel review that was conducted when he was up for his next promotion. The supplementary report was supposed to corroborate the original after-action findings. Marcus's voice was careful, precise. But there's a timeline inconsistency in it, a significant one. The supplementary report references an event sequence that contradicts two pieces of external documentation, a satellite pass log and a communications timestamp from the forward operating base that exist in separate classified systems that Voss apparently didn't know had been cross-archived. Emily's hand tightened on the phone. He made a mistake. He made the mistake that people make when they've been lying long enough that they forget which version of the truth they're living in, Marcus said. And now there's a crack in the record, a provable one. She stood up from the couch and went to the window again, the same window, the same smeared city lights. What happens next? Pierce is filing a formal inquiry through his JAG channel. His name carries weight, like you said. The inquiry will pull both reports. When they're compared against the external documentation, the inconsistency becomes a discrepancy on record, and a discrepancy on record in a classified personnel review it's not a small thing, Emily. It opens the real after-action report, she said. If we're right about what's in it, yes. He paused. It could take months. These things move at their own speed, but it's moving. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass, cool and solid. Outside, Caldwell Bay went on being ordinary and indifferent, all its lights and traffic and Thursday people, and she stood in her apartment 4 years older than the woman who had crossed a hostile corridor in the dark, and felt something shift under the careful, constructed quiet of her life, like the first movement of a thing that had been held down too long. There's something else, she said. Here, at the hospital. She told him about Metavance, about the pricing, about Marsh's absence from the meeting, about what Nate had said and what she'd found in the purchasing records. She told it quickly and without decoration. Marcus was quiet for a moment when she finished. That's a federal healthcare fraud pattern, if it's what you're describing. I know. That's a completely separate thing from the corridor. I know that too. She took her hand off the glass. But David Tran is already in the building, and his badge says Meridian Health Compliance Group, and I looked them up this afternoon. They hold 3 active federal contracts with the Department of Defense for healthcare system audits. They do military hospital compliance work. She paused. I'm probably overthinking the connection. Or you're not. He sounded like he was processing something fast. I want to know more about Marsh. So do I. She turned back toward the room. I'm going to try to get more of the documentation. Be careful, he said. That kind of thing, when people realize someone's looking, they start covering tracks. And covering tracks at a hospital involves a lot of people's medical outcomes. She heard what he wasn't quite saying. You think it's bigger than a vendor relationship. I think, Marcus said slowly, that procurement fraud in surgical hardware isn't usually the whole story. It's usually the part of the story that's easiest to see. And easy to see in healthcare means a long time and a lot of patience before anyone looked. A pause. How long has Marsh been in this role? 6 years. And nobody flagged the pricing before? Apparently not. Or apparently yes, and it went somewhere quiet. She thought of Whitmore, his managed incuriosity, the way he'd introduced Tran with the inflection of someone covering something. Tran's review covers 18 months of records. What if the problem is older than 18 months? She didn't have an answer for that. She was building one, from the pieces she could reach, from the shape of the edges she could see. It wasn't complete. It wasn't close to complete. But she knew enough about incomplete pictures to know this one was missing something large. I'll pull what I can access, she said, and then I'll talk to Tran. Emily. His voice changed slightly. You're doing it again. Doing what? Walking toward the thing everyone else is walking away from. He said it without judgment, just observation. She thought about what to say to that and couldn't find anything useful and settled for the truth. Someone has to. She hung up, stood in her apartment for a moment in the particular stillness of a decision that hadn't quite finished being made, and then she opened her laptop again and started pulling records. She worked for 2 hours. The further back she pushed into the accessible purchasing documentation, the clearer the pattern became. And the clearer the pattern became, the more certain she was that 18 months was not the beginning of it. The vendor relationship with Metovance predated Tran's audit window by what looked like at least 2 years. The same pricing structure, the same approval chains, the same signature on the authorization forms. Marcia's signature. Every time. She was writing up her notes when she found the anomaly she hadn't been looking for. Buried in the supply approval records from 22 months ago was an internal memo, a standard format, the kind that moved through the system without drawing attention because it was dressed like routine paperwork. It was a request for a secondary review of a vendor contract, filed by a nursing supervisor named Patricia Delgado. The memo flagged the Metovance pricing and requested an independent comparison against market rates. At the bottom of the memo, in the response field, was a single line from the Director of Operations. Request reviewed. No discrepancy identified. PD. C. Note regarding performance expectations for Q3. Patricia Delgado had been terminated 8 months later. Emily sat with that for a long time. Long enough for the coffee she'd made earlier to go entirely cold. Long enough for the city outside to quiet down from its evening mode into its late night mode, the traffic thinning, the lights dimming slightly the way city lights did when the people driving under them started going to sleep. She thought about Patricia Delgado, who had seen the right thing and said it through the right channel and been answered with a performance note and an exit. She thought about Whitmore, who may or may not have known, who may have been complicit or may have been another person managed into incuriosity. She thought about Marsh, whose signature was on every form, whose chair had been empty at Tuesday's meeting, who had 6 years and apparently at least 22 months of documented financial pattern that nobody had been allowed to look at. She thought about the patient in bed 7 with the hip replacement that had gone slightly wrong in a way nobody had clearly explained. She saved her notes, encrypted them with the same habit she'd developed in a different life for a different kind of sensitive information, and emailed a copy to herself and a copy to a secondary account she kept for the specific purpose of storing things she didn't want to lose. Then she looked up Patricia Delgado. The name returned a LinkedIn profile, a former hospital administrator now working for a healthcare advocacy nonprofit in a city 3 hours north of Caldwell Bay, and an email address on the nonprofit's contact page that was either still active or wasn't. Emily drafted an email carefully, the way she did things when she needed them to say exactly what she meant, and nothing that she didn't. She explained who she was. She explained what she'd found. She explained that she wasn't looking to cause trouble. And then she deleted that line because it wasn't true, and she'd spent long enough saying things that weren't true in the service of not causing trouble. She said instead that she was looking for the whole picture and that she believed Delgado had seen a piece of it and that she thought the piece mattered. She sent it. She closed the laptop and went to stand at the window one more time, looking at the light she'd been looking at all week. And she was still standing there when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. The text was 4 words. "We need to talk." She stared at it. She typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in under 30 seconds. "My name is Patricia Delgado. I've been waiting for someone from Caldwell Bay Regional to find that memo for 2 years. I need to tell you what they didn't put in writing." Emily called her back instead of texting. Some conversations didn't belong in writing. Patricia Delgado picked up on the second ring, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who had been waiting for a call they weren't sure would ever come. Not relieved exactly, more like braced. Like a person who had been holding a door shut for a long time and had finally felt a knock from the other side. "You found the memo," Delgado said. 2 hours ago." Emily was still standing at the window. "The response in the system says no discrepancy identified. Then you were terminated 8 months later." The termination was framed as a performance issue. They documented it carefully. Missed targets, communication problems, failure to meet leadership expectations. All of it written 6 months after I filed the memo, backdated in the language to sound like an ongoing pattern. Her voice was steady but not comfortable. "I hired an employment attorney. She said it would be very difficult to prove retaliation with the documentation they'd built. I didn't have the resources to fight it long enough." "So you left?" "I left." A pause. "But before I left, I made copies." Emily turned away from the window. "What kind of copies?" "Vendor approval chains, invoice records, internal email threads between Marsh and a man named Garrett Foles at Metavance Supply Solutions. Another pause, more deliberate this time. And an email from Whitmore's office to Marsh dated 4 days after I filed the memo. It doesn't say anything explicit. It's very carefully written, but it references a conversation they'd had, and it uses the phrase managing the Delgado situation in a way that, given what happened afterward, is not ambiguous. Emily sat down on the couch. Her legs had decided the information was heavier than she'd been carrying it standing. "How long does the documentation go back?" she asked. "From what I had access to, about 3.5 years. But Marsh was in the role 2 years before I got there, so the vendor relationship with Metavance started before my time." Delgado's voice tightened slightly. "I did some math. Conservative estimate, assuming the pricing discrepancy held consistent at the low end of what I could document. We're talking about a minimum of $4 million over 5 years, possibly significantly more. $4 million routed through surgical implant pricing, distributed across hundreds of individual procedures, invisible inside the noise of a hospital's normal operating costs." Emily thought about Bed 7 again, and then she made herself stop thinking about Bed 7 because the implications of that were a larger weight than she could carry and function simultaneously. "Foles," she said, "the Metavance contact. Do you know his relationship to Marsh?" "They went to the same university. I found that from a LinkedIn connection." A short pause. "I also found that Foles has held 3 separate sales territories in 3 years, all of which correspond to hospitals that subsequently switched to Metavance as their primary surgical supply vendor. The pricing in each case followed the same pattern." "It's not just Caldwell Bay Regional," Emily said. "No." Delgado's voice was flat. "I don't think it ever was." They talked for another 40 minutes. Delgado walked her through the documentation she had, what format it was in, where it was stored, what it could and couldn't prove on its own. She was methodical. She'd been living with this material for 2 years and knew its edges precisely. She knew what held up and what required corroboration, and she said so without being prompted, which told Emily something about the quality of her thinking. By the time they got off the call, it was close to midnight. Emily sat in her apartment with her notes and her laptop and the low hum of the city outside, and she thought carefully about the shape of what she was now holding. 2 things, running in parallel, connected only by the fact that she was standing at the center of both of them. The corridor and Voss and Pierce's formal inquiry moving through channels that took months. And this, Marsh and Metavance, and a woman who'd been pushed out 2 years ago and had spent the time since building a case nobody had yet been able to use. She sent Marcus a summary at 12:30 in the morning. She kept it factual, kept it tight, and at the end of it she wrote, "Delgado has documentation. She needs a federal contact. Trans review covers 18 months, but this goes back further. If his mandate can be extended and Delgado's records submitted as external evidence, the existing audit becomes the framework for a much larger case." She read it twice, then sent it. She went to sleep at 1 and woke at 5, which was normal for her, and started her shift at 7 with the specific operational focus of someone who had learned a long time ago to put everything in its own compartment and move between compartments without leaking. It held until Thursday afternoon, when she came out of a patient room on the 3rd floor and found Reginald Marsh standing in the corridor 20 feet away, looking at her. She'd seen him in passing before. He was a presence in the building in the way that senior physicians were, more felt than visible, referenced in conversations about decisions that had already been made by the time the floor staff heard about them. He was 61, large without being heavy, with the kind of composed authority that came from decades of being the person in the room whose opinion settled things. He was looking at her with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally very specific. "Nurse Carter," he said, not a question. He knew her name, which meant he'd looked her up, which meant something had moved faster than she'd expected. "Dr. Marsh?" She kept her voice even and her pace unhurried, the way she moved through difficult rooms. "I heard you attended the compliance meeting Tuesday." He fell into step beside her, which she hadn't invited and couldn't cleanly prevent without making a point of it. "It was a staff meeting. I'm staff." "Of course." He matched her pace precisely. "I wanted to make sure you understood the context. These audits tend to generate anxiety among staff, and I think it's important that people understand the scope is limited and the process is routine. David Tran seemed very thorough. Something moved through Marcia's expression, small, controlled, and not at all relaxed. Meridian does solid work. I have every confidence the review will reflect the integrity of our procurement process. Good. She stopped at the nursing station and turned to face him in the way that made continuing to walk beside her impossible without being obvious. Was there something specific you needed, Dr. Marsh? I have a patient in 318 who needs her afternoon assessment. He held her gaze for a moment with the comfortable weight of someone who was used to being the most important person in any hallway. No, he said. Just wanted to touch base. Get a sense of how the floor staff are processing the review. We're processing it fine. She held his gaze back without blinking and without warmth. We appreciate the transparency. He left. She watched him go and felt the precise shape of what had just happened settle over her skin like the drop in air pressure before weather arrived. He knew she was looking. She didn't know how he knew, but he knew. She texted Marcus from the supply room 2 minutes later. Marsh approached me on the floor, casual, fishing. We're running out of time on the documentation, Marcus replied in under a minute. Tran, today. Tell him everything. She found Tran in a small office the administration had set up for his review on the second floor, surrounded by files and the organized arrangement of someone working systematically through a large volume of material. He was alone. She knocked on the open door and he looked up with the same cataloging attention she'd noted in the meeting. Nurse Carter. He recognized her, which meant he'd been thorough enough in his preliminary review to put names to faces from the floor staff. Do you have a moment? I have about 10 minutes before I need to be back upstairs. She stepped in and closed the door. I have documentation I think extends beyond your current audit window. I think you need to see it. Tran set down his pen. His face didn't change dramatically, but his attention sharpened in a way that was unmistakable. How far back does it go? At minimum, 3.5 years? Possibly 5? A short silence. And the source? A former hospital administrator named Patricia Delgado, who was terminated approximately 22 months ago after she filed an internal memo flagging the Medavance pricing. Emily kept her voice clear and her pace efficient. She made copies before she left, vendor chains, invoice records, internal email correspondence between Marsh and a Medavance sales contact named Garrett Foles, and an email from Whitmore's office to Marsh referencing a conversation about, I'm quoting the language, managing the Delgado situation. Tran was very still. You said this goes back potentially 5 years. Conservatively $4 million. That's the low end of Delgado's estimate, based on what she could document. He looked at her for a moment with the particular assessment of someone recalibrating what kind of conversation they were now having. My current mandate covers 18 months. I know. She held his gaze. But your firm holds federal healthcare contracts with the Department of Defense. If this extends to other hospital systems, and I have reason to believe it does, through the same Medavance sales contact at different facilities, then the scope of what you're actually looking at isn't a billing discrepancy. It's a coordinated fraud pattern. What makes you think it extends to other facilities? Foles held 3 sales territories in 3 years. Each one corresponds to a hospital that switched to Medavance as primary surgical supplier. The pricing followed him. She watched his face. Medavance isn't a large company. They shouldn't have the market penetration they have unless the relationship model is the same everywhere. Tran picked up his pen again and set it down again. I need to make a call. This goes above my current authorization. He looked at her directly. I need Delgado's contact information and I need it today. If the documentation is what you're describing, the mandate for this review is going to change very quickly. Emily gave him Delgado's number and her own, and she was back on the 3rd floor in 9 minutes, which was 1 minute inside her estimate. She was doing a medication check on bed 12 when her phone vibrated in her pocket. She finished the check, documented it, and stepped into the corridor to look at the screen. It was Pierce. She called back immediately. The inquiry went through, Pierce said. JAG filed the formal request this morning. The inconsistency in Voss's supplementary report is now a matter of official record. He paused. Which means Voss was notified this afternoon that his service record is under formal review. How did he respond? He retained private counsel within the hour. Pierce's voice was controlled, but she could hear the thing underneath it that control was managing, which means he knows how serious this is. Another pause. There's something else. The JAG contact. She found something in the Cross archive. A communications log from the FOB on the night of the corridor mission. Timestamp puts the order to close the extraction window at 19 minutes before the point Voss's report claims the operational situation became unrecoverable. 19 minutes. Emily stood very still in the corridor of the third floor of Caldwell Bay Regional Medical Center, with a medication cart 6 feet away and a patient in bed 12 who needed a warm blanket and the ordinary sounds of a hospital floor pressing around her from every direction. 19 minutes that Reyes and Khatri had not been given. Emily? Pierce's voice came through carefully. Are you there? I'm here. Her voice came out steady. She'd learned steadiness from a long time of needing it. What happens when the inquiry accesses the full after-action report? It'll be compared against the communications log and the external documentation. If they match what we think they show, it's not what we think, she said. It's what they show. She paused. Voss ordered that window closed 19 minutes early to prevent an intelligence review that would have traced the source failure back to his desk, and 2 people died in that gap. She kept her voice flat, factual. The way she delivered hard truths in rooms that needed to stay calm. That's not an operational judgment. That's a decision made for career protection at the cost of lives. I know what it is, Pierce said quietly. And when the inquiry reaches that conclusion, and it won't be a personnel matter anymore. My JAG contact says we're looking at a criminal referral. The word landed differently than she'd expected it to. Not like relief. More like the first moment after a structural failure, when the building has started to move and everything that seemed fixed is suddenly in motion. How long? She asked. Weeks, not months. Once the formal inquiry surfaces the log discrepancy, the timeline compresses. There are people above my JAG contact who have been waiting for a provable thread on this for a long time. He paused. She told me there's a name that's come up in adjacent investigations, separate matters, different theater, but a pattern of documentation irregularities that kept pointing toward the same career trajectory. Nobody could connect it until now. What name? Emily asked. Pierce told her. She didn't say anything for a moment, because the name he said was not Gerald Voss. It was Reginald Marsh. The corridor of the third floor had never felt particularly narrow before. Now it did. Emily stood with her phone pressed to her ear, and the name Pierce had just said sitting in the air around her like something that had changed the temperature. And she did what she always did when something hit harder than expected. She breathed through it. One full breath. Slow, deliberate, the kind she'd used in rooms where the ceiling was coming down and panic was the most expensive thing she could afford. Say it again, she said. Pierce repeated it. Reginald Marsh, he came up in connection with a DoD healthcare contracting investigation that opened 14 months ago. A different facility, different state, similar fraud pattern. Inflated vendor pricing routed through a preferred supplier with personal ties to the procurement officer. The investigators hit a wall when the facility's documentation trail went cold, but the name Marsh appeared in 2 separate witness statements from former staff who'd flagged irregularities and been managed out. He paused. Nobody connected it to Caldwell Bay because nobody was looking at Caldwell Bay until Tran. Marsh wasn't just running a scheme at one hospital, Emily said. That appears to be the working theory. Tran's review opened the door here, and once his firm flagged it upward through their federal contract channel, it landed on the desk of the same investigators who'd been sitting on the other case. Pierce's voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone who had learned to carry large information without spilling it. They want to move quickly now. The concern is evidence preservation. If Marsh realizes the scope of what's coming, he already knows something's coming, Emily said. He approached me on the floor today. He was fishing. A short silence. How much does he know? I don't know. Enough to be paying attention. She looked down the corridor. A patient transport aide was moving a wheelchair toward the elevator. Ordinary afternoon. Pierce, there's documentation outside the hospital's system. A former administrator named Patricia Delgado. She has records going back 3.5 years, maybe further. Vendor chains, email correspondence. She gave me the contact information and I passed it to Tran an hour ago. Tell me Tran moved on it. He said he needed to make a call above his authorization. That was my read on someone who understood what he was now holding. She started walking, slow and deliberate, back toward the nursing station. Standing still felt wrong. The two investigations, the DOD case and whatever Tran's review becomes now, do they link? They link, Pierce said, if Marsh's connection to Medovance Supply Solutions extends back to military healthcare contracts. And according to my JAG contact, who has been looking at this for about 45 minutes now, Medovance held a peripheral position on a DOD regional supply contract 3 years ago. It was a small piece of a larger contract, low visibility, the kind of thing that doesn't draw scrutiny unless you're specifically looking for it. A pause that had weight in it. They were looking for it. Emily stopped walking. Marsh had access to military procurement. Through the DOD contract, Medovance did, which means Marsh's relationship with Foles wasn't just about a single hospital's surgical supply budget. Pierce's voice tightened fractionally. And it means the investigators who've been working the DOD case now have a thread that connects a retired brigadier general's documented misconduct to a civilian healthcare fraud operation through the same procurement period. She heard what he wasn't quite stating directly. Voss and Marsh, she said. You're saying there's a connection. I'm saying the timeline overlaps and the investigators are now asking that question. He let that land. I don't know the answer yet, but I know that Voss's promotion, the one that got him the Distinguished Service Medal, moved through a review board that included a DOD Healthcare Infrastructure Committee, and Marsh sat on that committee as a civilian medical consultant. The corridor felt narrower still. They knew each other, Emily said. They knew each other. She stood with that for a moment, turning it over, feeling the shape of something that had always been larger than what she could see from where she'd been standing. A classified operation buried under falsified reports. A hospital fraud scheme running for years behind routine paperwork. Two men who had met in the space where military structure and civilian healthcare overlapped, who had apparently found in each other something useful, something that held as long as nobody looked at the right angle. They'd been looking at the wrong angle for 4 years. What do you need from me? She asked. Right now? Stay visible and stay routine. Don't give Marsh a reason to accelerate whatever he's already thinking about doing. Pierce paused. The investigators want to move by end of week. Transfirm is filing an amended mandate request today. Expanded scope, extended audit window, full evidentiary preservation order. Once that's in place, Marsh can't touch the documentation without it being obstruction. And Voss? The criminal referral is being drafted. His attorney has already requested a delay in the inquiry timeline, which was denied. His voice carried a particular quiet satisfaction that was entirely appropriate and not dramatic about it. He's been informed that his service record review has expanded in scope. That's the official language. What it means practically is that the walls are closing, and he knows it, and there is nothing he can do about it that doesn't make it worse. After she hung up, Emily stood at the nursing station and documented her afternoon assessments with the careful thoroughness she brought to all documentation, which was not unrelated to the fact that she had spent the last 2 weeks thinking about what happened when documentation failed people. She did her job. She did it well. She did not look toward the stairwell that led to the administrative floor, and she did not check her phone more than twice in the next 2 hours. At 6:15, as her shift ended, she found a note in her locker. Paper, folded once. No envelope. Her name on the outside in handwriting she didn't recognize. She unfolded it in the locker room with 2 other nurses present, which was either fortunate or not, depending on what was in it. Your curiosity has been noted. Consider whether the outcome you want is worth what it will cost you. People who ask the wrong questions at the wrong time tend to find their professional histories examined very carefully. Yours might not hold up to that kind of attention. No signature. Of course, no signature. She refolded it, put it in her jacket pocket, and finished changing out of her scrubs with the same unremarkable efficiency she always brought to the end of a shift. Nate was pulling on his coat at the row of lockers behind her. He glanced at her face. You okay? Someone left me a note, she said. He looked at her steadily. What kind of note? The kind that wants me to be scared enough to stop. She pulled her jacket zipper. It's not going to work. He was quiet for a moment. Is this the thing we talked about the other day? Yeah. Is it moving? Faster than they expected. She turned to face him. Nate, I need to ask you something directly. The things you said you'd never said out loud, about vendor contracts, about the things you'd noticed over the years. How specific are they? He thought about it, not quickly. He thought the way someone did when they were deciding how much of themselves they were prepared to put into something that could cost them. Specific enough, he said finally. Dates, amounts, a conversation I had with Patricia Delgado the week before she was terminated. She asked me if I'd noticed the same things she had. I said yes. 2 days later, she was in a performance review. He held her gaze. I've thought about that conversation every week for 2 years. Would you be willing to give a formal statement? To who? Federal investigators, healthcare fraud, and DoD contracting. This has gone above the hospital audit level. She watched his face move through the calculation. I know what I'm asking. Yeah. He zipped his own coat slowly. Yeah, okay. He looked at the floor for a second and then back at her. Delgado got pushed out for doing the right thing through the right channel. I should have said something then. I was scared. He shrugged, the small, frustrated shrug of someone who'd had 2 years to be honest with themselves about a thing. I'm still a little scared, if we're being straight about it. So am I, Emily said. He looked at her, and she let him see that it was true, which was not nothing from someone who generally kept the inside of things on the inside. Okay, he said again. Tell me who to call. Chub. She forwarded the note to Marcus that night, photographed and sent without comment. He called back in 12 minutes. When did you find it? He asked. End of shift. Locker room, no envelope, no signature, my name on the outside. That's either Marsh directly or someone he told to do it. Either way, it means he's rattled enough to do something stupid. Marcus sounded not pleased. Exactly. He wasn't built for pleased, but focused in the way she'd come to recognize as his version of good news. Rattled people make mistakes. His attorney probably told him to sit still, and he's not sitting still. The note references my professional history, suggests it might not hold up to scrutiny. She kept her voice neutral. He's found out enough to know I have a gap. A pause. He can't access your classified service record. No, but he can access my employment history, my civilian resume, the gap years. If he's connected enough, she stopped. Marcus, if Voss and Marsh know each other the way Pierce thinks they might, and Marsh has started looking at me, there's a possibility that Voss has already told him enough to know who you are, Marcus finished. Yeah, I've been thinking about that since Pierce told me about the overlap. He paused. How much does Voss know about what you've been doing since you left the service? Nothing he could have known before this week. I'm not findable if you're not looking with the right tools. She thought about it. But if he ran my name through the right channel in the last 72 hours, which is when the inquiry notification would have landed on him, and if Marsh is in his network, then Marsh went to your locker today knowing more than just that you attended a staff meeting. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Emily, I need you to... I'm not leaving, she said. I wasn't going to tell you to leave. His voice was even. I was going to say I need you to be careful in a specific way, which is that Marsh doing something visible and documented is actually useful to us. The note is documented, a photograph of a handwritten note left in a hospital employee's private locker following a formal compliance review constitutes witness intimidation if it can be tied to him. She hadn't thought of it in those terms. She should have. 4 years ago, she would have, immediately. I need to give it to Tran, she said, and to the federal investigators. Tonight, if possible. She called Tran at 7:45. He answered, which told her he was still working, which told her the amended mandate request had moved faster than expected. She explained the note. He told her to preserve the original and send the photograph to an email address he gave her immediately. His voice had the tightly controlled energy of someone managing several moving pieces at once. The evidentiary preservation order came through 2 hours ago, he said. All hospital records, electronic and physical, procurement through administrative, are now under federal hold. Nobody touches them. Marsh knows? He was notified this afternoon. Standard procedure. A pause. He took the rest of the day as personal leave. She thought about what a man did with an afternoon when the walls had started closing and he'd just been told he couldn't touch anything. He's moving something, she said, outside the hospital system, something he didn't put in the preserved records because he was smart enough to keep it external. We're aware of that possibility, Tron said, with the careful precision of someone confirming something without confirming more than he was authorized to. It's being addressed. She got off the call, sat with the quiet, and felt the particular exhaustion of someone running two parallel tracks at full pace. The corridor, Marsh. Voss and Marsh and the 19 minutes and the procurement records and Delgado's files and Nate's 2-year-old guilt about a conversation he'd had the week before a woman lost her job. She made tea she didn't want and sat at her kitchen table and let herself be tired for approximately 12 minutes, which was the amount of time she could afford it. Then her email pinged. It was from an address she didn't recognize, with a subject line that was a string of numbers she would not have identified as anything meaningful if she hadn't spent several years learning what certain alphanumeric strings meant in classified communication contexts. It was a unit identifier. Shadow 6 Medical. She opened it with her hands very steady. The email contained 3 sentences and an attachment. You were right to start talking. There are others who've been waiting. Open the attachment only on a secured connection. The metadata will explain why. She looked at the attachment. A PDF. File name a long random string, no other identifying information. She did not open it on her home network. She sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, looking at the screen, thinking about who else had served with Shadow 6 Medical, who else would know what that unit designation meant, who else had been living for 4 years with something they hadn't been able to say. She thought about the debrief, about Voss standing over her in that room, very calm, very precise, making promises that were dressed as warnings. She'd assumed she was the only one he'd handled that way. She'd assumed it because it was easier, because the alternative, that there were others, that the buried truth was wider and deeper than a single after-action report, was a thing she hadn't been ready to look at. She called Marcus. I got an email, she said. Shadow 6 unit identifier in the subject line. 3 sentences and an attachment I haven't opened. Marcus went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Forward it to me right now. She forwarded it. Don't open the attachment, he said, already looking at it on his end. Give me 5 minutes. She gave him 8. When he called back, his voice had changed. Not alarmed, but recalibrated in the way it got when something significant had shifted. The metadata on the attachment is a DoD internal routing code, he said. I recognize the format. It's used for documents that were created inside a classified system and then extracted, legally, through formal declassification review, for use in an active investigation. He paused. This attachment wasn't sent to you by a private individual, Emily. Someone inside a federal investigative process sent you this. Someone who knows my connection to the unit. Someone who is building a case and wants you to know how far it goes. His voice was careful. They're not going to identify themselves in an email, but they're telling you something. That I'm not alone in this, she said. That the case is bigger than Voss. Marcus paused, and that somebody official knows it. She thought about that for a long moment. The kitchen quiet around her, the city outside doing its ordinary nighttime things, indifferent as always to what was happening inside the specific apartment of the specific woman who had once crossed a hostile corridor in the dark because she'd decided she wasn't going to let someone die just because the people above her had decided the math no longer worked out. What do I do with it? She asked. Pierce's JAG contact, Marcus said. Tonight. Tell her exactly what you received and how, and give her the email in full. If this is coming from inside a federal investigation, she'll know which one. And if she knows which one, he stopped. Then the investigation is further along than anyone told us, Emily finished. Yeah, he exhaled. I think we've been watching the surface of this thing. I think the depth of it has been running underneath us this whole time. She sat with that. It should have felt reassuring, and in some ways it did. In other ways it felt like standing in a room where the dimensions kept changing, where every wall she found was further back than the last one. Marcus, she said, if Voss and Marsh are connected through the DoD contract period, if this goes back further than the corridor, further than Caldwell Bay Regional, how many people are we actually talking about? I don't know, he said honestly, and that's the part that's been keeping me up. She called Pierce's JAG contact directly, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Okafor, who answered her personal cell on the third ring, and who, when Emily explained the email and the routing code, said, "Hold on," and went quiet for almost a full minute before coming back with the voice of someone who had just confirmed something significant. "I know what that document is," Okafor said. "I can't tell you how I know or confirm the source, but I need you to understand that what you've been handed is a corroborating record from an investigation that has been running for 11 months at a level that doesn't show up in anything publicly accessible." A pause. "You're not a peripheral figure in this, Ms. Carter. You are a primary witness in a case that is significantly larger than the Carvon Corridor inquiry." Emily was quiet for a moment. "How large?" "Large enough that I've been waiting for your name to surface for 4 months," Okafor said. "We knew there was a surviving medical officer from Shadow 6. We knew the after-action record had been manipulated. We knew Voss was the architect. What we didn't have was a first-hand witness who was willing to come forward." "I didn't know anyone was looking," Emily said. "That was by design. We needed the record to build before we approached witnesses. Otherwise, the approach itself tips off the subjects." Okafor's voice was measured and direct. "Ms. Carter, I need to ask you formally, are you willing to provide testimony, full account, on record, as part of a federal investigation into Gerald Voss, Reginald Marsh, and related parties?" The kitchen was very quiet. Emily thought about the bar, and Marcus sitting down uninvited, and the card she'd put in the breast pocket of her Henley close to where the pulse was. She thought about Reyes and Khatri. She thought about the patient in bed 7 whose hip replacement had gone slightly wrong. She thought about Patricia Delgado, who had used the right channel and been handed a performance note in a door, and who had spent 2 years in a nonprofit office 3 hours north keeping copies of documents that nobody had yet been able to use. She thought about the note in her locker, the handwriting she didn't recognize, the warning that her professional history might not hold up to scrutiny. "Yes," she said. "Good." Okafor's voice didn't change dramatically, but something in it settled. "We'll need you in person. There's a joint session being convened, DOD. Inspector General, the HHS Office of Inspector General, and one additional agency I'm not going to name on an unsecured line. The session is being held at a federal building in Merritt City. We're looking at Friday." "That's 2 days," Emily said. "I know. Is that a problem?" She thought about Marsh, who had taken personal leave that afternoon and was somewhere in the city doing something with the time he had left before the walls finished closing. She thought about how much damage a man could do in 2 days if he understood that 2 days was what he had. "No," she said. "That's fine. One more thing." Okafor paused in the way of someone who is deciding how much to give and has decided to give more than the minimum. "The document in your email. Open it when you're on a secured connection. I won't confirm what's in it, but I will tell you that you've been operating for 4 years under the assumption that you were alone in what happened in that corridor. You weren't. And the record that proves it has been sitting in a federal archive waiting for this investigation to reach the point where it could be used." Another pause. "You did the right thing that night, Ms. Carter. There are people who have known that for 4 years and haven't been able to say so. Friday is when that changes." She got off the call at 9:40. She sat at the kitchen table for a while without moving, and then she got up and found her laptop and drove 20 minutes to the public library, which she knew had a federal-grade secured connection on its research terminals, because she had once helped a patient navigate accessing his VA records remotely and had learned the terminal's connection protocol in the process. The library was closing in 40 minutes. She sat at a terminal in the back corner, logged into the secure access, opened her email, and opened the attachment. It was a 14-page document. The header was a DOD classification marking she recognized. Below it was a title: Supplementary Witness Record, Operation Carvon Corridor, Sealed Testimony, Cross-Referenced Personnel File. She read it in 35 minutes, which was cutting it close to closing time, and she read it with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything and with the sustained effort of keeping her face neutral in a public space while she read about the night that had ended her career, from the perspective of 4 people who had been there and had given sealed testimony within 18 months of the mission and had been told their statements were part of an ongoing classification hold that prevented their disclosure. 4 people who had seen what she'd done. 4 people whose statements corroborated, in specific and procedural detail, exactly what she had reported to the debrief officer before Voss had walked into the room and begun the careful construction of a different version. 4 people who had described, with the precision of military witnesses who understood that precision was the whole point, the 19-minute gap, the order given, the window closed, the 2 men who had been 2 kilometers out and moving, and one statement, the 4th one, that had been given by a signals operator at the forward operating base who had logged the communications in real time and whose log, combined with the satellite pass data that already existed in a separate archive, created a documented timeline so specific and unambiguous that no supplementary report, no matter how carefully constructed, could survive comparison with it. Voss had known about the signals log. He had accessed it once, 14 months after the mission, through a classified system request that had been logged automatically because all such accesses were logged automatically. He had then filed his supplementary report. And in the supplementary report, he had made the mistake that people made when they'd been living in a lie long enough to forget where the edges were. He had altered the timeline by a specific amount that he believed would absorb the discrepancy between his account and any record that might surface. He'd been wrong by 4 minutes. 4 minutes off in his calculation of what the log would show. 4 minutes that had made his report impossible to reconcile with the real record. Emily closed the document, logged out, and sat for a moment in the quiet of a public library at 9:58 in the evening, with the overhead lights the particular flat fluorescent of places that were about to close, and a librarian somewhere behind her beginning the end-of-night routine. She thought about Gerald Voss, who had spent 4 years collecting commendations and giving interviews about the weight of difficult decisions and sleeping well or not sleeping well. She genuinely didn't know and found that she no longer particularly cared which. She thought about Reginald Marsh, who had taken personal leave that afternoon with 2 days left before everything closed around him, and who was somewhere in this city making decisions about what to do with the time he had. And she thought about a thing she hadn't let herself think about very clearly in 4 years, which was the look in Logan Pierce's eyes in that compound in the dark, the specific expression of a man who had stopped expecting to be found and then had been, and the way he'd looked at her when she told him to hold pressure and save his breath and move. Like she was the most important thing he'd ever seen. She hadn't known what to do with that then. She'd filed it away in the deep compartment where she put things that were too large to carry and too real to discard. She got up, pushed in her chair, and walked out into the Caldwell Bay night. Her phone was ringing before she reached her car. It was Marcus. His voice, when she answered, was not the steady, measured voice she'd learned to read over the past weeks. "Emily," he said, "Marsh is gone." She stopped walking. "What do you mean, gone?" His wife reported him missing to Caldwell Bay PD 2 hours ago. He left the house at 4 this afternoon and didn't come back. His car is in the driveway. His phone is on the kitchen counter. A short pause. His laptop is not in the house. And there's a federal hold on his records that he can't have removed any documentation through, which means if he took anything, it was something he'd already moved outside the system. She stood in the parking lot with the cold air off the bay finding the gaps in her jacket. "He's running," she said. "Or he's making contact with someone who can help him manage what's coming." Marcus's voice was tight. "Either way, the investigators have been notified. Okafor knows. The question is what he does in the next..." He stopped. "Emily, if he and Voss are in contact right now, and if Voss has told him who you are and what you know..." "He already left me a note," she said. "He's done what he was going to do directly." That was before he disappeared. Before the preservation order and the personal leave and whatever he found out this afternoon that made him leave his phone on his kitchen counter. Marcus paused. "I need you to not be alone tonight." She looked at the dark parking lot. The library's exterior lights were the only illumination out here, and they were the kind that left deep shadows between the pools of light. She'd parked in one of those shadows out of a habit that was suddenly feeling less like habit and more like instinct. "I have somewhere I can go," she said. "Go there now." She got in her car, locked the doors, and sat for a moment before starting it. The city around her was ordinary and dark, and full of its own ordinary business. Somewhere in it, a man who'd spent years building a careful structure of fraud and silence had picked up his laptop and left his phone on the counter and walked out of his house. She thought about the note in her locker. Your professional history might not hold up. She thought about what Marsh might know and who might have told him, and what a man did when the window was closing and he had 2 days and a laptop and someone else's name. She started the car, and as she pulled out of the lot, her headlights swept across the entrance of the library, and for just a moment, half a second, the length of a headlight arc, she saw a figure standing in the shadow at the side of the building, watching. By the time she'd turned fully to look, it was gone. She drove without taking a direct route, which was old instinct and she didn't fight it. 3 turns that weren't strictly necessary. A pause at a stop sign where she checked her mirrors with the specific thoroughness of someone who had learned in a different life that the mirrors mattered. Nothing followed her. The figure at the library entrance could have been anyone. A smoker, a person waiting for a ride. Her own exhaustion manufacturing significance in a shadow. She drove to Nate's house because it was the closest thing to a safe place she had in this city that wasn't her own apartment, and because Nate had said yes that afternoon without taking very long about it, which mattered more than she'd expected. He opened the door, still in his work clothes, one of the twins asleep on the couch behind him in the specific boneless way of small children, the TV on low. He looked at her face and stepped back to let her in without asking questions first, which she filed away as something she would be grateful for later when she had the capacity for gratitude. "Marsh is missing," she said when he'd closed the door. "Missing like he left his house this afternoon and didn't come back and left his phone behind." She sat at his kitchen table. "Federal investigators have been notified. I'm testifying Friday in Merritt City." Nate stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, looking at her with the expression of a man recalibrating how large the thing he'd agreed to was. "Okay," he said finally. "You want coffee or something stronger?" "Coffee," she said. "I need to think clearly." He made coffee and she sat at his kitchen table and they talked through it. Not all of it, not the corridor parts, just the hospital parts, the Metavance parts, the shape of what Tran's expanded investigation was going to require from both of them. Nate listened with his hands around his mug and asked 3 specific questions that were the right questions, and when she'd answered them, he nodded once and said, "I'll be there Friday, wherever they need me." She slept on his couch with the twins' blanket because the twin had migrated to a bedroom somewhere around midnight and left it behind. She didn't sleep deeply, but she slept, which was more than the last several nights had given her. Marsh surfaced at 6:14 the next morning at the Caldwell Bay Harbor Ferry Terminal, attempting to board a private charter under a name that wasn't his. The charter operator, who had a federal compliance agreement on file from a previous marina audit, had a system that flagged false identification on departure manifests and did what the system was designed to make him do, which was make a phone call. Marsh was detained at the terminal by 2 federal agents who had been tracking his phone's last known location backward through the tower records and had arrived at the harbor at 6:05. He had his laptop in a bag. He had $17,000 in cash. He had the look, according to the report Emily read later, of a man who had understood for approximately 12 hours that the math was finished and had spent those hours trying to find a door that didn't exist. He was not violent. He was not dramatic. He sat in the back of a federal vehicle at the harbor with the harbor behind him, going about its early morning business, boats and gulls and the flat gray light off the water, and said nothing without his attorney present, which was the only intelligent decision he made that morning. By 9 a.m., the evidentiary hold on Caldwell Bay Regional Medical Center's records had been transferred to active case status. By 10, Trans Meridian Health Compliance Team, working now under direct federal investigative authority, had begun the expanded audit. By noon, the hospital's board had placed Director Whitmore on administrative leave pending the investigation's findings, and an interim director had been named. Emily heard about most of this while doing her job, because her job didn't stop being her job while the world rearranged itself outside the third-floor windows. She had patients. She had afternoon assessments and medication checks and a post-surgical consult that needed careful attention. She did all of it with the same focused competence she always brought to it, and somewhere in the middle of the afternoon she realized that the specific weight she'd been carrying for 2 weeks, the layered, pressing weight of watching and calculating and waiting, had shifted into something different. Not lighter, just different. More like motion than compression. Nate passed her in the corridor at 2 and said, very quietly, "I got a call from a federal investigator. Interview tomorrow morning." He looked at her. "You were right. They want the Delgado conversation specifically." "Tell them everything," she said. "Don't soften it." "I know." He paused. "Patricia Delgado flew in this morning. She's meeting with them today." Emily nodded. She'd known Delgado was coming, woke. Okafor had told her. She thought about Delgado on a plane with her 2 years of carefully preserved files. All that patience and containment finally arriving at the place it was always building toward, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close to it. The earned version of close. Merritt City was 3 hours by road, and Emily drove it Friday morning in the early dark, leaving Caldwell Bay at 5 so she'd have time. The federal building where the joint session was being held was a plain government structure in the Civic Center district, the kind of building that communicated seriousness through its total absence of aesthetic ambition. She found parking, went through security, and was escorted to a waiting area outside a conference room by a clerk who offered her water and didn't make small talk, for which she was grateful. Marcus was already there. He was standing near the window in a dark jacket that fit the way his civilian clothes always fit, like something he'd arrived at rather than chosen, and he looked at her when she came in with the specific expression of someone who had moved a thing a very long distance and was now watching it arrive. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She thought about it honestly. "I'm not sure yet. Ask me after." He nodded. That was enough. Pierce arrived 12 minutes later in uniform, which Emily hadn't expected, and then immediately understood. He was taller than his voice had suggested, mid-40s, the kind of build that had once been used hard and had settled into something steadier. He had a daughter named Maya who was 6 years old and knew her father had been hurt once and that some people had helped him home. He walked into the waiting area and saw Emily, and he stopped. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Emily Carter," he said finally. "Commander Pierce." He crossed the room and extended his hand, and she shook it, and he held it a beat longer than a standard handshake, with the controlled grip of someone who was managing something that wanted to come out differently. His jaw was set. His eyes were not. "I've been trying to figure out for 4 years what I would say to you," he said. "I still don't have it." You don't have to have it," she said. "We have work to do first." He almost smiled. "Yeah." He released her hand. "We do." The joint session lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Emily didn't know exactly who was in the room when she sat down to give her testimony, because several of the attendees were introduced by role rather than name, which was standard for this kind of proceeding and which she understood without having to be told. She gave her account from the beginning: her unit assignment, the corridor operation, the failures in the intelligence package, the moment the extraction window closed, the decision she made, and every specific procedural detail of what happened between that decision and the moment Logan Pierce was loaded onto an extraction vehicle. She was asked 12 clarifying questions. She answered each one precisely and without embellishment, because the truth was specific enough on its own that it didn't need decoration, and because she'd learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you could do in a room full of people who needed to believe you was say exactly what happened with no performance around it. When she was done, the room was quiet for a moment. Lieutenant Colonel Okafor, who was seated at the far end of the table, looked at her with an expression that was professionally composed and personally not. "Thank you, Ms. Carter. The record reflects your full testimony. Is there anything you'd like to add?" Emily thought about it. Only that the 2 men who didn't make it out, Reyes and Khatri, deserved to be in this record by name, not as an operational loss. By name. Okafor wrote something. "Noted. They will be." The proceedings against Gerald Voss moved fast after that, the way things moved fast when the evidentiary foundation was complete and the only remaining variable was the formal mechanism of consequence. His criminal referral was accepted by the DoD Inspector General's office within 2 weeks of Emily's testimony. His private attorney filed 2 separate motions to delay, both denied. His service record review concluded with findings that were unambiguous in their language, a word Emily had been told by Okafor, who used it specifically because it mattered that the official finding left no interpretive space. His Distinguished Service Medal was revoked. His retirement rank was formally reduced. The specific commendation that had been awarded for his conduct during the Karvan Corridor operational period was struck from the record with language that cited falsification of official documents, obstruction of a formal military inquiry, and conduct prejudicial to the integrity of the armed forces. He was charged. The charges were public. They appeared in the kind of coverage that ran in defense and government accountability publications rather than general news, which was neither dramatic nor invisible. It was the specific register of consequence for men who had operated inside systems that the public mostly didn't watch until something broke. Reginald Marsh's case moved on a separate track through federal court. The charges were healthcare fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and obstruction. Garrett Foles at Metavance Supply Solutions was charged separately but concurrently. 3 additional hospital systems were identified as part of the scheme. The total estimated fraud figure across all facilities and the full span of the operation came out in court filings as something significantly larger than Patricia Delgado's conservative estimate. The number had enough zeros that it appeared in general news coverage briefly before being absorbed into the ordinary ongoing noise of institutional failure. Whitmore was not charged with fraud. He was charged with obstruction, a lesser version, related to the handling of Delgado's internal memo. His attorney negotiated a plea. He resigned. He was not, Emily thought, a fundamentally corrupt man. He was the other kind, which was a man who had found it easier to look away than to look, and had made that choice enough times that the looking away had become the whole of his character. Patricia Delgado testified for 2 days. Her documentation was admitted as evidence in full. When the fraud case went to the sentencing phase, the judge referenced the 2-year period between Delgado's termination and the investigation's opening as an aggravating factor. A woman had done the right thing, had been punished for it by the very mechanism meant to prevent such punishment, and the scheme had continued for 2 more years because of that punishment. Delgado called Emily the evening after the sentencing to tell her. She didn't say anything elaborate, neither did Emily. Some things didn't need a lot of words once they were finished. The ceremony at Harbor Ridge Veterans Medical Center was held on a Tuesday morning in late November, which was overcast and cold in the specific way of coastal winter. The kind of cold that didn't have anything to prove and got right to the point. The building was newer than its name suggested, a modern facility that served the veteran population of 3 counties, and its main assembly room had been arranged with the particular ordered attention of military ceremony, which had its own language and its own weight. Emily had been told to wear civilian attire, which she had, and had been told to arrive at 8:45, which she had been told that the proceeding would take approximately 90 minutes, which it did not. It ran 2 hours and 12 minutes, because these things always ran long when there were enough people in the room who had been waiting a long time to say something and finally had the space to say it. Marcus was there. Nate had driven 3 hours to be there, which Emily hadn't asked him to do and which he'd done anyway, showing up in the parking lot at 8:30 in a coat that suggested he'd bought it recently for exactly this occasion. Delgado was there, seated 3 rows back, with the composed expression of someone who had spent 2 years carrying something heavy and had recently put it down and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. Okafor spoke. A DoD representative spoke. The formal language of military recognition had its own cadence, specific, procedural, weighted by the understanding that the words meant something precise, and the institution saying them was acknowledging exactly what it had previously failed to acknowledge. Emily's service record was formally corrected. The unauthorized breach notation was struck. The after-action report that had stood for 4 years as the official account of what had happened in the Karvan Corridor was replaced in the record by the documented truth, which included the sealed testimony of the 4 witnesses and the communications log and the satellite data and Emily's own account, and which described what she had done with the specific, unambiguous language that Okafor had said mattered. She received the commendation she'd been denied. The formal citation read her name and unit designation aloud, which was the first time since the debrief room that anyone in an official capacity had said those 2 things together without immediately moving to erase them. Then Logan Pierce walked to the front of the room. He was in full dress uniform, and he moved with the deliberate purpose of someone for whom this moment had been a long time arriving and who intended to give it the full weight of his attention. He stopped in front of Emily and he looked at her with the expression she remembered from a dark compound 4 years ago, which was not the same expression. It had years in it now, and a daughter named Maya, and the specific shape of a life built on a foundation that someone had held steady when the ground was going. But it was related to that expression, a later version of it. He saluted her. The room went quiet in the way rooms went quiet when something true was happening. "You saved my life when everyone above you had already written me off," he said. His voice was steady, but working to stay that way. "I've had 4 years to think about what to say to you, and I still don't have anything that fits inside a sentence." "You don't need one," Emily said. "No." He held the salute for another moment, then lowered his hand. "But I'm going to say something anyway." He looked at her directly. "I have a daughter. She started first grade in September. She's learning to read and she likes dinosaurs and drawing and absolutely refuses to eat anything orange." He paused. "She exists because you walked into a place you weren't supposed to go. And I'm not going to let that be a classified record. Not anymore." Emily looked at him, and the thing she had kept in the deep compartment for 4 years, the look in his eyes in that dark compound, the thing she hadn't known what to do with, finally had somewhere to go. It didn't disappear. It just settled into something that could be carried differently. "You would have done the same," she said. "Maybe." He held her gaze. "But you did." Afterward, outside in the cold November air, Marcus stood beside her on the building's front steps, while the ceremony dispersed around them. People moved through the parking lot in the ordinary way of people leaving a significant event and returning to lives that continued regardless. Nate was talking to Delgado near a car. Okafor was on a phone call, her back to the wind. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked. Emily looked at the overcast sky, the flat winter light off the bay visible between the buildings at the end of the block. "Pierce asked me if I'd be interested in consulting for his foundation, veteran medical support, trauma care protocol, the gap between what people need coming out and what the system currently offers. Are you interested?" She thought about the patient in bed 7, about Delgado in her nonprofit office 3 hours north, doing the work that nobody was paying enough attention to, about Reyes and Khatri, whose names were now in a federal record by name, as Emily had asked, and whose families had been notified through a channel Okafor had opened that the official record had been corrected, and that their people had been lost because a man had made a decision for the wrong reasons, and that decision was now a matter of public record. None of that brought anyone home. She'd known that from the beginning, and she knew it still. Justice and restoration were not the same thing, and anyone who told you they were had never lost someone to a decision made in a room they weren't allowed into. But the record was true now. The names were in it, and the man who had built his reputation on the buried version of events was facing what he'd spent 4 years avoiding in public, with consequences that couldn't be appealed away. It wasn't everything, but it was real, and it was earned, and it had happened because she'd picked up a card from a bar counter and made a phone call she'd been afraid to make. "Yeah," she said, "I'm interested." Marcus nodded. He looked at the same overcast sky for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad I sat down." "So am I." She meant it. "Even though you were annoying about it." He almost laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere genuine rather than the surface. "I was not annoying. You told me I'd been clocked from 3 Thursdays away. That was honest, not annoying." "They're not mutually exclusive," she said. He did laugh then, and she let herself do the same, briefly, in the cold November air outside a veterans facility in a city that was still ordinary and indifferent and full of its ordinary lit-up human business, exactly as it had always been. The difference was that she was standing in it differently now, not smaller, not performing okay for the benefit of whoever might be watching, just herself. The whole version, the classified and the visible, the decorated and the tired, the woman who had walked into a hostile corridor in the dark because she'd decided the math the people above her were doing was wrong, and who had been right about that, and who had spent 4 years being required to pretend otherwise. She didn't have to pretend anymore. That was what it came down to, finally. Not the ceremony or the corrected record or Pierce's salute or even the specific procedural ruin that was now descending on Voss and Marsh through channels that had no more patience for delay. Those things mattered, and she wouldn't minimize them. But the thing that sat deepest, the thing she'd carry forward, was simpler than any of it. She had known what was true. She had held on to it for 4 years in a city where nobody knew her name. And when the knock came at the door, from a man who sat down uninvited at the end of a bar and asked the right question, she had answered it. That was the whole story. The rest was consequence. She pulled her jacket against the cold, looked at the bay light between the buildings one more time, and walked down the steps toward whatever came next. Not unburdened, not uncomplicated, but clear. Quiet. Sure of herself in the specific way that no one could give you and no one could take, because you built it the only way it could be built, which was by doing the hard thing when it would have been easier not to, and by refusing, even when it cost you everything, to let the wrong version stand. There are people in every room who get looked past, people whose records have been altered, whose names have been buried, whose ignorance was purchased with threats or exhaustion, or the simple institutional weight of being told that what they know is not what happened. This story is fiction, but the pattern it describes is not rare. The person everyone assumes is just a nurse, just an administrator, just a floor employee, just a junior officer, is sometimes the one holding the truth that the whole structure is built to suppress. The question is never whether that truth survives. It always survives. The question is whether the person holding it decides the cost of speaking is worth paying. Emily Carter decided yes. Most people who decide that don't get a ceremony. They get something smaller and harder and more permanent. The knowledge that when it mattered, they didn't look away. That's not nothing. That's everything.